Hello, I'm Jacques Halbronn. I would like to continue my collection of my succession of lectures on French astrology, and this time I will discourse on Nostradamus and also on a subject which is not connected directly to France, which is the prophecy of the popes connected with Saint Malachy, supposed to be of Irish origin, and who is supposed to be especially the author of this prophecy. Both works were published finally at the end of the 16th century, and they are more or less contemporary, as a matter of fact. The prophecies of the centuries are made of quatrains, verses, and the prophecy of Malachi are sort of verses, not really verses, but some formula from some mottos, very short lines of text. So in both cases I would speak of a sort of reduction of the prose. Reduction of the prose, because in the case of Malachi, Saint Malachi, it is obviously derived from histories of the popes, which existed at the previous time. So these formulas were taken from these histories. For each pope, they would take certain words which were taken from those texts, in text and prose. And in the case of Nostradamus, it was more or less the same. These quatrains were most probably, as I proved it in several papers, you can refer to my Halbronn's researches on Mario Gregorio's website called prophecies.it. So, which are in French. So, these quatrains were all taken from text and prose. They were derived from both text and prose. It is true for the almanacs. The quatrains of the almanac were taken from the predictions in prose, and the quatrains of the centuries are most probably also taken from text and prose. So it's difficult to say that those quatrains are of Nostradamus. They use certain words, certain significance, we would say in linguistics, which exist in Nostradamus' writings, but they are combined in a way which has nothing to do, really, with the original text. So it's ambiguous to say it's Nostradamus if you just consider the words separately, and it's not of Nostradamus because he doesn't express properly what he thought, and it's not Nostradamus either because it is connected from any calendar, any references to planetary positions, except a few, very few cases, which are well known. So the question I would like to discuss this morning of the 20th May 2014 is the question of the Nostradamical criticism. Like there is a biblical criticism, critique. In what way, since the 17th century, do the historians and bibliographers, etc., have studied critically the quatrains, and especially those of the century? So, well, I will necessarily be brief in this briefing, and I would say that in fact, one of the difficulties, and I like to compare this criticism on the centuries of the criticism on the Bible, which appeared both of them in the 17th century. And obviously the criticism on the Bible has much more advanced and progressed than the criticism upon the centuries, well, at least until very recently, through my own work. But why is it so late for Nostradamical criticism to constitute itself? One of the reasons is, paradoxically, that Nostradamus belongs to a much later period, to the period of the printing process, which started in the middle of the 15th century, that is 1 century before. Actually, he was born in 1503, so 50 years, around 50 years after the beginning of the Gutenberg process. While, of course, as we know, the Bible is referred to lots of manuscripts. And when you have manuscripts, your methodology is different than when you have printing material. The tendency when you have printing material is just to use information which appear on this material, especially the name of the publisher, the date of the publishing things. So, it's a very easy task recently. Well, not necessarily the rest of the problem, but the possibility of dating documents is something which is made more or less automatically just by reading what is written on the first page. And that's what people did on Nostradamus, especially in 1989 and 1990 by Shomara and Robert de Nazra, who just more or less reproduced what was written on the covers of the books they were treating. On the other hand, of course, as to the Bible, it was different. There was always the problem of dating the documents by extra information, and because documents would be, well, there were all sorts of difficulties that had to be solved bibliographically, that people accustomed to work on printed materials are not very familiar with. So that was one of the reasons. Because if really you work in a very objective way, that is, you just forget the names of the publishers, you just forget the names of the dates which are mentioned, and you just consider the content of the various editions, and you classify them chronologically, but only on the basis of the content, not on the basis of the external appearance. Then you have a succession of editions, and you can see a progression in the content. I repeat, if you forget what's written on the cover, and then you see that there is a group of editions which is a sort of developing process, because you see that there are more and more quatrains coming, added. You see that something is in progress, and that at a certain level it reaches a certain achievement, and after that it remains more or less permanent. The problem is that among those achieved editions, you have editions which bear the date, dates when Nostradamus was still alive, while the first editions we mentioned before, according to their content, only appear in the 80s, 1580s. That is 20 years after the death of Nostradamus, more or less. So we have a problem. Most bibliographies on Nostradamus still insist, still consider that there were really a first group of publications in the during the life of Nostradamus, with a certain progress. 4 centuries in 1555, 7 centuries in 1557, 10 centuries in 1568. So they are their progression. Then we reach the 80s, and then they may say, well, was a regression. Part of what was published in the 50s, 60s disappeared, was not transmitted properly, completely, and that we have to wait until the end of the 90s, of 1590s, to recover what was already published in the 50s, 60s. But their thesis, let me say, it's not, among others, as far as I know, for Benazra. This is the thesis that precisely I reject radically. I think that those supposedly published editions, centuries in the 50s and 60s, are false, are forgeries, and that they are very similar to the editions of the end of the 16th century, because they are just copies of it, but antedated copies. This is the point. So I maintain that the first editions of the centuries is totally posthumous, and not only posthumous, but only occur in the middle of the 1580s. That is more or less the beginning of the Liga, of the League, the Catholic League against Henry IV, and then to become Henry IV, Henry de Navarre, and who was the heir of Henry III after the death of François d'Alençon, who would have succeeded to his brother if he had not died prematurely. So people do not all agree about all this chronology. So I must also add that my position is that those patterns of the centuries are not necessarily, as I said before, are not necessarily made by others, by Nostradamus. I mean, they are not by Nostradamus formally, but as I said, a great deal of them is taken from prose documents by Nostradamus, which were not necessarily published at this time, but a part was really published indeed, and they were taken from the library of Nostradamus. Apparently, when he died, he kept all sorts of documents in a room, waiting for the proper person to exploit his stock of things. There were things which were never published. There were things which had been used for publication, drafts, etc. there were probably notes about readings made, a sort of cocktail of all sorts of things. And this is what gives birth to the century. Who I did it, this is another story. I won't come back on that. I published developments, as I said, in Halbronn's researches. The fact is that in the first attempt, they were published without any commentary, probably because the idea was to introduce quatrains which were by themselves very significant, and that it was not necessary to make any commentary. The quatrains would speak by themselves about the situation at the time of the read. But sometimes they were, as we know because we can compare with some sources, they were retouched, they were rewritten. Not totally, but some word here and there was replaced by another word, more appropriate, and without speaking of probably quatrains which were just made up for the circumstance without really even using old material. Which means that this literature was political and historical, more than prophetical. I mean, it was prophetical because it was supposed to have been written before the events, but it was speaking on what already was known or was about to have happened, not necessarily for a long period afterwards. Well, this is another story. So, in 1594, was published the first great commentary on the quatrains, not only the Centuries quatrain, but also the Almanac one, by a certain Janus Gallicus, Jean-Aimé de Charvilliers. And this is a real commentary of all these quatrains, but it is classified according to chronology, not the chronology which is intrinsic, which emanates from the quatrains, the chronology which emanates from the events, from the correlations. If such quatrain correspond to a certain moment, a certain event, then you put it at this event, etc. As for, it is the same process, in fact, more or less, as for the prophecies of the popes, because what has happened is that the commentator, the exegesis, uses chronicles, historical chronicles, of the second part of the 16th century, for about 30, 40 years, and he compares the words of these chronicles to the words of the quatrains. And when he finds any connection between some words of the chronicles and some words which are in prose and some words of the quatrains, then he says, well, it's okay, that was what it was all about, etc. So you have a very complex process. The quatrains themselves come from prose documents by Nostradamus, more or less, and the commentaries on these quatrains come from prose historical documents, chronicles. There are always this sort of transformation, commentaries on quatrains by using chronicles in prose, creation of quatrains by using what was kept in the library of Nostradamus many years after his death. So there's a sort of cuisine here, which is very interesting to study. And finally, I would say that the actual reason for producing such books, such editions, is not totally clear. Why did it take so much time and care to produce false editions and to produce groups of centuries meaning 100 quatrains? Each centuries includes, theoretically in principle, 100 quatrains, quatrains meaning 4 verses. So each century comprehend more or less 400 verses. And why all this work, sometimes using old material of the 50s to give a more authentic appearance to the forgeries, etc. Why all this luxury of work, of details? We don't know exactly. Sometimes, as we say in French, a mountain gets us a mouse. Like it was true for the centuries of St. Malachy. They were covering hundreds and hundreds of years since the 13th century, just to permit, apparently, the election of the one specific pope at the end of the 16th century. And so, only a few words are meaningful, and the rest is just to replenish, to fill the whole thing. And here also, I think that under the cover of a sort of prophetical, historical work, and I believe that there was some message connected directly with some very concrete stakes of the time. At the time of the dynastic crisis, at the time when it was about to determine who was the new king of France after the end of the Valois, etc. Probably something like that. At this time, people apparently were ready to invest a lot of time and material just to justify a very limited prognostic or announcement or prophecy, which people would know it exists, and they would say, oh, that's true, this text was not written for that circumstance, because it covers such a long period before, so that gives more credit to the document. Although, in fact, it was written to influence what was at stake in the 1990s. Because, as a matter of fact, you know that Henry IV was crowned in 1594, and that the first circulation of Malachy's prophecies is of 1595. It is connected with a very specific election, they say. And afterwards, of course, in Malachi it's interesting because they don't only cover the period before the 16th and 16th centuries, but also a long period afterwards. And, well, that was also more or less scheduled about Nostradamus, but not that much, in fact, not that much. Later on, of course, the quatrains were interpreted for periods after the 16th century. But I'm not sure that it was seen that way at the beginning, although the book which was published in 1594 says it is the first volume connected. It's called the Janus, Nostradamus is one who looks backward and forward. So the only edition which was published was the first period, the retrospective period. But it was announced that would be a second volume, which was never really published by the same author, although we can find some elements in his Pleiades, which was published at the beginning of the 17th century. Well, anyway, what is clear is that the first motivation was probably very casual. So we are here in France, especially with Patrick Guinard, who is also a specialist, because many specialists on Nostradamus are in fact French, like Benazra, Chamara, myself, Guinard, and also Canadian like Garnon and stuff, and Jacques, etc. But there is also some English specialists like Le Mesurier or others, or Brenda Moore also, who is a French writer from Quebec, who wrote a very important work on Nostradamus. But the question is rather, what a very funny point is the present translation. Translation is a very important way of commenting text, interpreting text. We as French people, we cannot translate Nostradamus that easily because it's already in French. Although some people wrote a sort of modern Nostradamus, but generally we have really to stick to the original text, because in fact the French of Nostradamus is not so strange to us. No. But if I were German or English speaker, I would have more or less to translate for my readers. And then there would be temptations, of course, of translating. It's more or less the same with the Bible. Translations are also not necessarily neutral. And some words are translated in a certain way, they might be translated in another way. So, as soon as you decide to translate, there is already a form of interpretation, of reinterpretation of Nostradamus. And that has helped a lot, if you can say so. It has helped a lot because people would see Nostradamus through the translations, since they would not know French. And that will give less importance to the interpretation, because the translation is itself an interpretation. But let us not forget that already in 1594, in the Janus Gallicus, it was written both in French and Latin, published in Lyon. So the author of the first major commentary on Nostradamus, he did it in two languages, and it is obvious that his Latin translations of the Testament are very, very special and very transformed compared to the French original. I would like to end with a question of the history of Nostradamical criticism. The first attacks on the integrity, supposed integrity of the centuries, was led by a Dominican father by the name of Geoffroy de Rechac, alias Jean de Sainte-Marie, and I dedicated part of it to this work, which was published partially in 1656 under the name Éclaircissement des véritables quatrains, something like that. And he says two things. He says, I don't want to hear of the catchments of the almanacs, because I heard that those almanacs were forgeries, even those who were published under his name. So I am very doubtful about these quatrains, and I won't keep them within the canon. Second thing, would say Jacques, he would say, oh no, I won't take the 6 cents. So there are the quatrains with 4 verses and 6 cents with 6 verses. And there was, at the beginning of the 17th century, which is a few decades before Jacques published his Éclaircissement, there were editions including an extra volume comprehending 58 6 cents, that is 58 strophes of 6 verses, preceded by an epistle to Henry IV by a certain heir or cousin, who would say, well, it comes from the library of Nostradamus, it has reached me, and I've discovered them, and I published them. This epistle was dated 1605, under the reign of Henry IV, who was to die in 1610. So, this is a very interesting epistle, because precisely it is exactly the spirit, I think, in which the centuries were originally introduced to the public. That is, posthumously, probably the first posthumous editions have disappeared, and they might reappear, as a matter of fact, because there are proofs, indications that they are being kept partially, but not localized, actually. And probably the very first edition of the Centuries would exactly correspond to this style of the epistle of 1605. That is, we have recovered a certain number of documents in the library of the defunct of the Nostradamus, etc., late Nostradamus, and now we present them to the public. These indications do not figure, I must say, in the 1500 and 80s edition, and they of course do not figure in the 1550 edition, but they do not either appear in the 1568 edition, which is 2 years after Nostradamus' death, which is probably a mistake by the forger, because they should have said, well, it is, because actually in the 1568 they were introducing 3 last centuries which were not in the 1555, 1557 edition. So they might have said, well, we have found these documents. Well, it is introduced by the epistle to Henry II, but that is not clearly said. Okay, so I think that probably in the middle of the 1580s, there were first real editions, which are false editions, in such a way, but the real false editions, which were saying, we have recovered those documents which were left by Nostradamus in his library at his death, and now only after years of prison, as would say Chavigny in his brief life of Nostradamus, after this period of expectation, they finally are published and given to the public. So, as I said, the first attacks against Nostradamus, authentic works, came at this period of the middle of 17th century, and later on, only we have some beginning of criticism in the 19th century. Although they did not identify immediately the forgery of concerning the edition of 1566 by Pierre Rigaud. Although Pierre Rigaud did not work at this time, it was his father, Benoit Rigaud, so it was a mistake by the Avignon publisher of the 18th century. They made a mistake about the first name of the publisher, and that was, of course, creating a certain doubt, which developed an attack against this 1566 edition, although Torlet-Chavigny and Peltier in the 1850s, 60s were basing their whole work on this 1566 edition. So, finally, in spite of this attack against the 1566 edition by Pierre Rigaud, most of the 20th century elapsed, developed without any additional criticism. Although Daniel Rousseau had developed, had gathered an enormous library, but he didn't help advancing in this line. Although there is one specific document which has been lost or which is not localized, and that Rousseau described, which is a Grand Prophecy, Grand Prediction in 4 centuries, published in 1888. So why was such an edition only in 4 centuries in 1588? That's a question. While already were supposed to have been published editions of the same volume and more volume a long time ago. So why did they republish this edition and afterwards, immediately after, editions with more centuries? There's a great confusion in history, but if this book would reappear and would be scanned or reprinted, it would be a great help. So I hope some of you will try to find where it is, probably in one of the American libraries or private libraries somewhere, in Texas maybe, I don't know. So, what was a great blow against Nostradamic criticism, and I will end with that, is that Nostradamologists started to look in most libraries in the world for the first editions of the centuries, like my friend Robert Benazra. And they discovered 1555 editions of the centuries by Massé Bonan. So they had the proof, the concrete material proof, that there had been such an edition. So all the doubts about, possible doubts about this edition were supposed to be neutralized and destroyed. This is a sort of interesting conjuncture of circumstances. It's like Waterloo, who is coming the first, Blucher or Grouchy. So instead of discovering the first editions of the 1580s, the very first editions of the appearance of the centuries, they discovered the fourth editions, which were made at the end of the 16th century. And this was a bad moment in the 1980s, 1990s, because it stopped more or less the critical approach of the question. And it is exactly at this time that I started to introduce myself in this field, and I really had a complicated task, because I had to prove that these editions, which the forgeries having been rediscovered, were forgeries. And of course, the Nostradamologists who had made such an effort to rediscover, to exhume these editions, they were not ready at all to accept, to confess that they were wrong editions.